Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Hello, my name is Father Perricone. I'm so happy that you have decided to join us in these series of talks. I teach philosophy at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, New York. There probably are dozens of St. Francis's College, but I'm right in the middle of the Big Apple. And again, I'm happy to be with you here today. We began in our last time together to talk about how it's possible for man, any man, Catholic, non-Catholic, believer, unbeliever, to arrive at a certain knowledge of God's existence. Just to review quickly, we mentioned that it is possible for man to have this knowledge of God's existence, even though most men come to a knowledge of God's existence through the goodness of the Catholic Church and her revelation. Nonetheless, it is really important for Catholics to recognize that man, in his unaided reason, can come to know that God exists. In fact, that ought to be the first step before we ever start talking about the riches that are contained in supernatural revelation. Why? It will be clear to your hearer when you're trying to engage in conversation to first settle upon the fact that this supreme being does exist. And once convincing your hearer of that, it becomes much simpler for you to be able to talk about the fact that this supreme being has spoken to us. We are guided in our discussions by St. Thomas Aquinas, the great common doctor of the Catholic Church, whom we know lived in the 13th century. He set down in his great work, the Summa Theologiae, 5 proofs for God's existence. Important, as we mentioned before, to recognize that every one of them has a starting point, which is extremely important to recognize. The starting point is in the world of nature. It is in the world that's accessible to each and every one of our experience. So you see, since this common experience is public and available to everyone should be able to come to a certitude of God's existence. He has 5 ways of doing that. I just began briefly to summarize the starting points of each one. Let me begin again. His first way is commonly known as the proof from motion. Thomas wants us to look at what is very conspicuous in natural things, that they move. Some move themselves, others are moved by other things. But you see how filled with common sense Thomas is. Is anyone going to deny, or is anyone going to be offended, or is anyone going to say you're asking for too much if you simply want them to notice that things move? That's the starting point for St. Thomas in the first proof. Starting point is slightly different for each and every of the other ones. Second proof. St. Thomas wants to begin with the fact that everything that we look at is caused. Everything is an effect of something else. Again, that truth is available to everyone. Who could deny it? He's going to proceed from there to demonstrate God's existence. In the third way, which is called the proof from necessity, he's simply going to ask us, look at everything in the world. What do we see about it? That none of it ever had to exist. In fact, everything we see had a beginning, and everything in the world will come to an end. From that observation, St. Thomas will take us to demonstrating God's existence. The fourth, Thomas is going to ask us to look at perfections in things. Something is more or less good. Someone is more or less wise. Another thing is more or less beautiful. Fairly common sense. And from there he's going to demonstrate God's existence. And the final one, the one we'll have a lot of fun with, is that fifth proof. We call this the proof from finality. That each and everything which exists has a purpose for its movement. You see, everything that exists acts. And St. Thomas is going to bring our attention to the fact that everything, living and non-living, acts for a purpose. Well, wait till you see what he deals with that. Let's begin with the first one. It's probably the one that's a little bit less exciting than that fifth, but important. St. Thomas is going to establish a blueprint here, important for you to remember in all your discussions with anyone regarding God's existence. He's talking about movement. Everything moves. Essentially, when St. Thomas talks about movement, he's talking about change. Things all go from being of one kind to being of another kind. You might remember your old philosophy classes and recognize that there are two kinds of change. Things change substantially. And so, if I were to, God forbid, collapse and die here, I would undergo a substantial change. What would it be? Well, the substance of my body being alive would change. Change to what? Change to no longer being alive. Something would change in that body. There would no longer be Father Pericone there any longer. It used to be Father Pericone, but by virtue of a change, which is substantial, Father Pericone is not there any longer. But then, of course, there are other kinds of changes called accidental. That means that while this thing under question still remains itself, something about it is altered. So, if I were to appear on the next program with 2 red stripes down each one of my cheeks, that would constitute an accidental change. You would say, Father Pericone is different. There are 2 red stripes down his cheeks, but it's still Father Pericone. That is an example of accidental change. Or if Father Pericone were to lose all his hair, accident. Or if I would appear in the next program with a very raspy voice because I'm just recovering from the flu, the raspy voice, example of accidental change. So that's in general what we're talking about in change. Is movement. Movement always requires something moving the mover. That's common sense, isn't it? Something is required to move the mover. Let's take an example of, the sun. It's now moving. It probably has been moving for who knows how many years. But the point is that it doesn't move itself. Its movement had to be created by someone else outside of itself. Well, we could even talk about living things. You might say, but Father, living things move themselves, unlike the sun, which needs a mover. So isn't St. Thomas wrong? No, he's not wrong. Because even you, who are living, or any living thing, a bumblebee, or even a tree, they do move themselves, by virtue of some principle within themselves. But St. Thomas would ask, but something had to move that. He ultimately comes down with this principle, that whatever is moved is always moved by something else. Now, Thomas says, since everything moves, we are going to have to look to something which has moved it. So, you might say, the sun, was moved by something that existed before the sun, and that thing existed before that, and that existed before that. Well, take the example of a train. You're waiting for the train with great annoyance one day, and you see the train, one piece being moved by the one in back of it, and that one being moved by one in back of it, and that one being moved in back of it. Let's say there are 1,000 of these cars, all being moved by something before it. Well, St. Thomas would say, you can't really explain the movement going on. You can't explain the movement going on just by saying the one before it moved it. That's not enough. The human intellect wants a greater reason. Because if you keep on doing that, saying the car before that car that I see is being moved by the one before it, well, you keep on going back and then back again, and you never stop going back, and yet at the same time, you never really come to the first mover who got the whole thing started to begin with. By the way, that's a big problem in logic, and Aristotle called it an infinite regression. You can't, in explaining movement, simply go to the thing that existed prior, like that set of trains, and expect to come up with an intellectually satisfying answer. Eventually, you're going to have to give me the prime mover, the first mover. And the hint, the important thing about that mover is that it or he doesn't require any movement from anyone else. Ah, there's their answer. Well, you're not going to be able to find in this world of ours a prime mover except in God. St. Thomas says, therefore, movement in the world is ultimately explained not by going prior to the thing that we see being moved. That leads to an infinite regression, which after all proves nothing because it doesn't get to the first mover. And so therefore, not getting to the first mover, there's no reason why any movement exists at all. Thomas said that's ridiculous because we do know that movement exists. The only logical answer is to say that there is a primary, a first mover who himself doesn't need anyone to move him. St. Thomas calls this the unmoved mover, the very end of that paragraph of the first way he said, in this we call God. There's a similar thing going on for causality in that second proof. Each and everything is not a cause of itself. Everything requires to be caused by something outside of it. Very clear, isn't it? If you were the cause of yourself, that would mean that while not existing, you caused yourself to exist. Well, that's preposterous. It's a violation of common sense. Something that doesn't exist can't cause itself to exist. You require something outside of yourself. Of course, you can't do what a lot of empirical scientists do today and just keep on going back on the level of, well, this thing caused that thing, which caused that thing, because ultimately you're not getting to the answer. What is it that caused anything to exist at all? That itself requires no existence. For that. The intellect requires an uncaused cause. And this we call God. That third proof, from necessity of being. St. Thomas says, again, look at things in the world. They all come into existence, they all come out of existence. None of them have within themselves, the power to keep themselves in existence or bring themselves into existence. That's the reason why he calls everything in the world contingent being. Contingent means they depend upon something else for their very existence, But we can't go on constantly and talk about things that depend upon something else for their existence. Can't do that forever. That's an infinite regression. It offends logic. We have to come ultimately to a being that has within itself its own necessity of existing. It owes its existence to nothing except itself. This thing St. Thomas calls God. He is a necessary being not having to receive existence for anyone because he is pure existence. That fourth way has to do with the grades of perfection. Things are more or less beautiful. Things are more or less wise. Things are more or less good. Things have a more or less share of being. No one can deny that you who are listening to me have more of a share of existence, of being, than the chair you're sitting on. It's just common sense. Now St. Thomas will ask, well, if we all have only a share, then that means there must be someone who has the perfection of all that. Perhaps next time we will talk about that last proof. And it probably will require for us to spend a very long time on it, because it really involves countering so many of the errors that Roman Catholics find, especially in the area of the empirical sciences. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you've been interested enough by St. Thomas for the next lecture, the final one, the fifth way. God bless you.
Gloria